Chapter 9. California Dream. Gazing out the windows while gripping a baseball bat, Jim could only hope that those who were kicking in the door of his neighbor's house wouldn't head their way. It had been days since the electronics stopped working, and the last 24 hours had been the most scared Jim had been in his life. The world had spiraled out of control to the point that daydreams of going on job searches like his mother wanted were a thing of fantasy. Looking down at the bat in his hand, he knew this was now his only protection. He wondered where the police were. Thinking back, the last time he remembered seeing any kind of law enforcement was walking down the street with the rest of the people trying to make it home when the power went out. Since then, the more days that passed, the less the criminals hid what they were doing. Now, all he could do was watch as they pillaged houses all over his block and wait for them to reach his home. He knew it would be soon. "Mom, you see anything?" Jim asked his mother, who was watching out the backyard through an opening between the kitchen table and the coffee table, which were now both nailed up to the sliding doors. Being a big fan of survival shows, she put that knowledge to use as best as she could. Fastened to the end of a broom handle was her favorite and largest kitchen knife. Standing watch with it at the ready, not knowing if she would be able to use the makeshift spear, it still brought her a measure of comfort to have it. What she really wished she had was a gun, something that never crossed her mind before. She had voted yes on every bill to restrict them that came to the ballot box. As she had been hearing gunfire for the last day or two, her opinion regarding the subject changed drastically with the absence of law. Her eyes darted back and forth over the backyard. Nothing. She yawned uncontrollably from the lack of sleep. She didn't know how long it had been since she'd last closed her eyes. "They're still in the Murphy's house. I hope they are okay. Were they home?" Walking out of the other room, Jim's best friend Larry answered, "No. Richard said they were going to the lake. Lucky them, though I didn't think it when he told me about their trip." The closest Jim or Larry came to the outdoors was the beach area by the boardwalk. Larry and his parents had decided to go with Jim to his house, hoping that they would have power. After spending the night, they all came to the conclusion that if it took days for the power to be restored, then it would be a good idea to stick together. With the power still not returning, their togetherness became a matter of safety in numbers. Now that was going to be challenged. "Hey, everyone!" Jim all but screamed to get their attention. "They are coming out!" He watched the small group of people who had earlier kicked in the front door of the Murphy's house. Now they were exiting, joking and cutting up as if they owned the place. "They're drinking and eating chips." Larry's dad moved over to one of the windows where he could see across the street. "Hopefully they will just stay there or go back to their own home. From the looks of them, I'm not sure they have a home." The clothing they wore reminded Jim of those who lived under overpasses and in alleys more than anything. He could also tell that they were updating their wardrobe, as one removed his shirt and slid into a fresh one he had apparently taken from the Murphy's house. All day, Jim kept an eye on the growing group of people gathering at the Murphys. When night fell, he hoped they would tire from all the drinking and horse-playing they seemed to enjoy. That hope was quickly extinguished as furniture was carried out to the front yard and set on fire. Jim watched and watched as the night went on. At some point, his eyes grew too heavy to stay open. What felt like the blinking of his eyes brought the light of day. Startled by what seemed an instant change, Jim reached for the bat that had fallen to the floor before once again focusing his attention on the neighbor's house. There he saw in the yard a smoldering fire with many people lying around, blackened earth where before there had been lush green grass. Jim watched the group of home invaders with a gut feeling that they would be next. The more of them who awakened from their drunken slumber, the tighter the knot became in his gut. Each time one of them picked up an empty bottle and attempted to take another drink, they became obviously agitated as they looked around for more. It was only a matter of time before they moved on to the next house, and just then, Jim noticed many of them looking in their direction. "Hey, one of them is heading this way," Larry's father stated almost in a panic as his wife gripped his arm tightly. Looking over at him, Jim wondered just what his wife saw in him. "Calm down, man, and be quiet," At the same time, he thought, "You should be telling me that, Puddin'." Although Jim felt a little panic himself, he wasn't going to show it in front of his best friend. He looked around the room to make sure the others were doing the same. Satisfied, he slowly lowered himself to the floor alongside the couch. They were all still hoping that the guy would move on to the next house. Listening to his footsteps on the porch caused Larry's father's panic attack to increase. It didn't help when the guy knocked on the door and asked, "Anyone in there?" A thought occurred to Jim about the time the guy stopped knocking and they heard his footsteps leaving. Should we be quiet? Things have changed. It wasn't an annoying neighbor they were hiding from. After all, the Murphys were not home, and they went in anyhow. Understanding it was a little too late for second-guessing their decision, Jim returned to the opening in the boarded-up window and watched as the guy walked back across the street. Once among his group, they began talking, and Jim felt the knot in his gut turn into a hangman's noose when the guy pointed in their direction. "Mom, it looks like we're going to have company," Jim said loudly as the others shushed him. "Do you really think it was a good idea being quiet when he was knocking?" It led them to think it was another empty house. He could see a few of them understood what he was saying. As he expected, Larry's father looked as if he was going to hyperventilate. "If they come over, we just need to act normal, make a normal amount of noise. If they hear people inside, we stand a better chance of them moving on." The last one to reluctantly rise from the floor was Larry's father, just as Jim expected. Jim walked over to the window to see if this morning was going to be the day he had been waiting for. As he bent over and focused, he received his answer. He watched as many more people came out of the Murphys' house. To Jim, they seemed to be gathering before moving over. As he watched many of them pointing, he knew they were indeed coming. They didn't wait for everyone to exit the house before heading for their next house to pick clean. Jim's mother gasped at the sight. "What do we do?" Still watching as the group was about to enter the street, Jim replied, "Make noise, everyone!" As they looked around the room for a way to make some noise, Jim kept his focus on the group, which was now in the street. Out of nowhere, they heard a rumble followed by the house, and everything in it shaking. As the rumbling grew louder, Jim heard someone holler, "Is it an earthquake?" "Earthquakes don't last this long or rumble this loud," another replied. Jim looked back to the group in the street. They were looking up to the sky and pointing, and each wore a surprised expression. Jim watched the sky from where he was, hoping to get a glimpse of what they were pointing at. In an instant he knew, as the group disappeared along with the front of his home. He and the rest were carried through the air to the backside of the house from the blast. Upon awakening, Jim's first thought was of his mother. "Mom! Mom!" he called out, receiving no reply. Throwing the remnants of what used to be the front of their home off him as he attempted to stand, he felt as if he had just been tackled multiple times by a linebacker. With a few moans and groans, Jim made it to his feet. Looking around the room, he began to wonder what had happened, and then the thought of his mother re-entered his thoughts. "Mom!" Jim cried out again as he began searching, fear taking over at the sight of a severed leg. He called out as he moved more broken lumber and sheetrock. From the corner of his eye, he spotted movement on the other side of the room and began making his way over. Moving through the rubble was difficult and not helped by the sight of unrecognizable human body parts. As he neared, a couch cushion flew up, revealing Larry gasping for air. "Larry!" Jim called, happy to see that his best friend had made it. Jim reached down and grabbed his hand to pull him up. As he did, everything began to darken, and little pinpoints of light danced in his vision. Slowing down his movements helped, but it was too late, and he felt himself falling forward onto Larry with little control of his body. "You okay, man?" Larry asked, looking down at his friend. Puzzled by now as he was looking up at Larry rather than down at him, he replied, "What happened?" "I just got that crap off me and then you fell on me. That's what happened. Are you okay?" Jim rubbed his head and felt something wet. "I must have taken a blow to my head. Help me up. I have to find my mom." With one hand out and the other holding his side, Larry slowly helped Jim to his feet. Jimmy, Jimmy? Mom? Still dizzy, Jim turned slowly in the direction of her faint voice. Just inside of what used to be the kitchen, he found her buried under some rubble. Larry helped Jim remove the wreckage. The more they moved, the more blood they uncovered. Lifting the last little bit, they spotted the source as they had feared. Buried deep in his mother's chest and still protruding out was a fragment of asphalt from the street. Jim placed his hands around the fragment in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. Tears filled his eyes. I'll go get help, Mom. You're going to be okay. Looking up at her son, she knew he was going to be the last sight she would see. Jimmy, there is no help out there. I love you, son. As she coughed out the word and choked on the blood filling her lungs, she did her best to smile in hopes he would remember that, rather than the agony she was in. Without another word, her eyes slowly began to close, making it only halfway before the end came.